All right, hopefully you can hear me okay. It's a little windy out here. A brief prefatory remark before picking up where we left off in part 2 is okay. So why can't the single thing, the one thing, in this case, in my perspective, the divine person, why can't it be one without difference or distinction? Well, given that the one here is infinite, if it had no distinction, it would be an empty void. So, to try to speak of the something as non-differentiated is just another way of talking about everything being nothing, which doesn't get us anywhere. And it would be impossible to account for how the one could then produce anything. How could it produce the infinite variety of beings and objects that we see and experience? So, therefore, the divine person is constituted by, as I said, two things. So now we can move on to discuss what those two things are. And it's very simply, I would say, that the two main things which constitute a human person at the localized level constitute God as a person at the infinite level. And in this case, they are spirit and body. The spirit needs to be unpacked a little bit. By spirit, I'm talking about mind, as the Greeks understood it, and in particular, as even the Eastern Church understood it, the mind, or the nous, which they considered the seat of the soul, or the eye of the soul, or the center of the soul, which is where the essence of the person resides. It's the essence of the radical subject, of the willing, volitional subject, which, in this case, I would say, as far as God is concerned, his spirit permeates or interpenetrates his entire body, which is infinite. And then his body is that out of which the cosmos is produced, and the infinite variety of things that are produced within the cosmos. Okay, so this is where we need to kind of stop for a second and just do a little compare and contrast with Kashmir Shaivism. Kashmir Shaivism teaches that God, not all Kashmir Shaivists, but many, would call themselves theistic personalists. They would see God as the supreme person, and they do recognize that he is constituted of two principles, the masculine and the feminine, or the God and the goddess, which would be proper designations for my own distinction between God's body and his spirit. And the problem, as I see it, with Kashmir Shaivism is that it wants to designate Shiva, the masculine principle, as pure awareness or consciousness, which is that out of which everything is produced. And then Shakti, or the goddess principle, is the energy which allows for, I guess it's the energy that brings about the production out of this pure awareness of Shiva. So I'm in full compliance and agreement with this Shiva Shakti polarity within God as constituting the Supreme Person, but I don't agree with designating those two poles as consciousness versus energy. Rather, it should be spirit or pure awareness, the awareness of self-awareness, and the body of God. Consciousness and energy don't constitute a person. Those are aspects of a person. A person does have energy or exudes energy, for example, but energy isn't, the two-dimensionality of a spirit, the inner person and the outer person, is what is essentially needed to constitute a human being as a person, as well as God. So what ends up happening then is that the Kashmir Shaivist equates pure awareness, the awareness of the self, which for me is more specifically identical with the nous, or the mind, or the spirit, and equates it with consciousness in general. And so that what that does is to tell us that a human being is only greater than a plant or an animal in the sense that he has a greater degree of consciousness. What I'm saying is that a human person is qualitatively distinct by virtue of having a nous, which is not something that an animal or a plant has. And the nous is what enables us to come into contact with the divine being, to communicate, so to speak, with the divine being, and to enter into union with that divine being. And it allows the divine, that infinite divinity, to communicate and enter into union with us simultaneously. It's a mutual thing. So there is a devotional aspect, a quote-unquote dual aspect to this non-dual relationship between the worshiper and God. What else could I say about that? Yeah, and then of course, the reason that plurality has to constitute the one God, rather than being an absolute principle in and of itself, is that by having multiple things that are uncaused and eternal, you would have no one thing that binds everything together. There would be simply absolute chaos. You couldn't even rely on the laws of logic. They wouldn't work. They wouldn't exist to relate everything to every other thing. And we couldn't even have a dialogue. We couldn't have a rational discussion or talk about how this relates to that, or how this being relates to that being, because everything would be intrinsically unrelated and disunified. Okay, so we talked about where I agree with Kashmir Shaivism and where I disagree with Kashmir Shaivism. As we go, we will have some more comparing and contrasting to do, particularly with Zoroastrianism and Sufism. And then we'll also, here coming up, we'll be talking about Heraclitus, his logos, what Heraclitus' logos was, and how it fits into my understanding of the person of God. I want to see Heraclitus' logos as that principle which exists as the essential unity of the two things that comprise the person of God. It is the nexus, so to speak, between the spirit and body, or the masculine and the feminine. So that's what we'll do next.